The Principes were Roman soldiers who formed the second line of battle in the legions of the Republic. They were not princes of royal blood, but common men who had earned their place through experience and economic capacity. Their name came from Principes, which meant the first or the principal, because they represented the best of each generation of soldiers. These men were between 26 and 35 years old. They were no longer inexperienced youths, but neither were they tired veterans. They were at the perfect moment of their lives, strong, experienced, and determined. Most possessed small lands or prosperous workshops. They had families to support and properties to defend. When Rome called them to war, they left their fields and businesses because they understood that defending the city was defending their own future. The Roman military system divided soldiers according to their age and wealth. The youngest, called hastati, formed the first line. Behind came the Principes, and in the third line waited the triarii, the most ancient veterans. This organization allowed each group to do what it knew how to do best. The hastati attacked first with all the energy of youth. If they encountered strong resistance, they retreated and the Principes took control. These more experienced soldiers knew when to press and when to wait. If even they failed, the triarii covered the retreat or launched a final desperate attack. The Principes organized themselves into units called maniples. Each maniple had 120 men divided into 2 centuries of 60 soldiers each. A centurion commanded each century, and the most veteran of the 2 directed the entire maniple. There were 15 maniples of Principes in each legion, which gave a total of 1,800 men in the second line. Each soldier had to buy his own equipment. This meant that only men with sufficient money could serve as Principes. Their equipment was expensive but effective. They wore a mail coat that covered their torso, a bronze or iron helmet, and a large rectangular shield called a scutum. This shield measured more than a meter in height and was made of wood covered with leather and reinforced with metal. Their main weapon was the gladius, a short sword of about 60 centimeters. This sword was perfect for close combat. It was not very long, so it did not tangle with those of other soldiers, but it was heavy enough to pierce armor. Before using the sword, they threw their pilum, special javelins that bent when stuck in enemy shields. This made it so the enemy could not return them and added extra weight to their shields. The training of the Principes was hard. They practiced with wooden swords against posts until their movements became automatic. They ran long distances carrying all their equipment. They built fortified camps every night during marches. They learned to obey orders without thinking, because in battle there was no time for doubts. But most important was that they learned to trust their companions. A Princeps knew that the man at his side would do his job, no matter what happened. This mutual trust was what made the Roman army work. They did not fight as individual warriors trying to win personal glory. They fought as a well-oiled machine where each piece had its function. The Principes participated in all the great battles of the Republic. Their first great test came in the Samnite Wars, when Rome fought for control of central Italy. In these rocky mountains, the Principes learned to adapt their tactics to difficult terrain. The Samnites were tough warriors who knew every valley and every mountain pass. But the Principes demonstrated that Roman discipline could prevail even on enemy territory. During the Punic Wars, the Principes faced their greatest challenge. At the river Trebia, in the year 218 before Christ, Hannibal ambushed them on a freezing morning. The Principes fought in water up to their knees. with their equipment soaked and their muscles numb from cold. Despite the terrible conditions, they maintained their formation long enough for part of the army to escape. At Lake Trasimene, a year later, they fell into another of Hannibal's traps. The Carthaginian had hidden his troops in the hills around the lake, covered by morning fog. When the Romans advanced along the shore, enemies appeared from all sides. The Principes fought back to back, surrounded by water on one side and enemies on the other. Many died that day, but their resistance allowed some companions to reach Rome with news of the defeat. Then came Cannae, in the year 216 before Christ, the battle that almost destroyed Rome. Hannibal had prepared a brilliant trap. He let the Romans push his center backward, and when the Hostati and Principes advanced thinking they were winning, Hannibal's African troops attacked from the flanks and cavalry closed the encirclement from behind. The Principes found themselves trapped along with the rest of the Roman army. The sun beat mercilessly and dust filled the air. Men fought so tightly packed they could barely move their arms. But even surrounded and without hope, they maintained their formation and continued fighting for hours. They rejected offers of surrender and fought to the end. It was a devastating defeat, but it showed what kind of soldiers these men were. The lesson of Cannae was not lost. Roman commanders learned to be more careful with their formations. During the following years, the Principes fought in a different war. They no longer sought decisive battles. Instead, they harassed Hannibal, cut his supply lines, and recovered cities, one by one. At Nola, Marcellus used the Principes to counterattack when Hannibal came too close to the walls. At Capua, they helped in the siege that deprived the Carthaginians of their most important base in Italy. Meanwhile, other Principes fought in Spain under Scipio Africanus. At Cartagena, they stormed the walls of the most fortified Carthaginian city in Hispania. At Baecula, they broke Hasdrubal's lines when he tried to march to Italy to help his brother Hannibal. At Ilipa, they executed a complex maneuver that enveloped the entire Carthaginian army and practically ended Punic resistance in Spain. At Zama, 14 years after Cannae, Scipio used more flexible tactics against Hannibal himself. This time he deployed the Principes differently, leaving wider spaces between units so that Carthaginian war elephants could pass through without causing damage. The Principes maintained their discipline when the enormous animals charged toward them. They did not break ranks or run in panic. Their steadiness allowed Roman light infantry to eliminate the elephant threat without disorganizing the main lines. Then, when the moment for hand-to-hand combat arrived, the Principes demonstrated why they were considered Rome's best soldiers. Many of these men had survived Cannae. Now they had their revenge. After defeating Carthage, the Principes marched east. At Kinocephalae in the year 197 before Christ, they faced the famous Macedonian phalanx. These soldiers fought with long spears in closed formations, a tactic that had conquered half the world under Alexander the Great. But the Principes demonstrated that Roman flexibility could overcome even the phalanx. When irregular terrain broke the Macedonian formation, the Principes infiltrated through the gaps and attacked from the flanks. At Magnesia, in the year 190 before Christ, they faced the army of Seleucid king Antiochus III. Here their role was less dramatic but equally important. Antiochus had elephants, armored cavalry, scythed chariots, and soldiers from a dozen different nations. But the Principes provided the stability the Roman army needed to maintain cohesion, while fighting against complex Hellenistic formations and their fearsome heavy cavalry. At Pydna, in the year 168 before Christ, they participated in the final battle against Macedonia. King Perseus had assembled the last great phalanx of the Hellenistic world. At first, the long Macedonian spears stopped the Roman hastati, but when the Principes advanced on more irregular terrain, their superior training made the difference. They could maneuver individually while maintaining group cohesion, something the rigid phalanx could not do. The Principes also fought in less famous but equally important wars. In Spain, they spent decades subjugating Iberian and Celtiberian tribes. At Numantia, they participated in the long siege that finally broke Hispanic resistance. In Gaul, before Caesar, they helped establish the Roman province that protected trade routes to the north. In each battle, the Principes demonstrated the same qualities: discipline under pressure, tactical flexibility, and unwavering loyalty to their companions. It did not matter if they fought in the mountains of Spain, the plains of Africa, or the valleys of Greece. They adapted their methods but never abandoned their fundamental principles. But the world was changing. Constant wars had ruined many of the small proprietors who traditionally formed the ranks of the Principes. Men spent years away from home fighting in Spain, Africa, or Greece. When they returned, they often found their fields abandoned and their families in debt. At the same time, the wealthy bought more and more land, creating large latifundia worked by slaves. The citizen soldiers who had built Rome's power found themselves without place in this new economy. Rome needed armies, but it increasingly had fewer men who met the property requirements to serve. The crisis reached its peak during the wars against Germanic invaders at the end of the 2nd century before Christ. Gaius Marius, an ambitious general who had reached the consulship, faced the reality that Rome did not have enough soldiers to defend its borders. The Cimbri and Teutones threatened to invade Italy, but the traditional army could no longer recruit enough men. Marius made a decision that changed Roman history. In the year 107 before Christ, he opened the army to citizens without property. For the first time, the poor could enlist as soldiers. The state would provide them with equipment and training. In exchange, they would serve for decades as professional soldiers. This reform eliminated the basis of the system that had created the Principes. It no longer mattered how much money a man had or what properties he possessed. All heavy infantry soldiers received the same equipment and the same training. The distinction between hastati, principes, and triarii gradually disappeared. The new soldiers organized themselves into cohorts instead of maniples. Each cohort mixed veteran and novice soldiers in the same unit. There were no longer separate lines based on age and experience. Everyone fought together, forming a more homogeneous mass and, in many aspects, more effective. But something was lost in the process. The Principes had represented an ideal of Roman citizenship. Men who had succeeded in civilian life but who were willing to risk everything for the common good. The new professional soldiers were more skilled, but their loyalty was directed toward their commanders, not toward Rome itself. This transformation helped create the armies that would conquer the Mediterranean world, but it also planted the seeds of the civil wars that would destroy the Republic. The Principes had fought for their homes and families. The new legionaries fought for the promise of lands and loot that only their generals could provide them. The Principes disappeared from history, but their legacy endured. They had established standards of discipline and professionalism that would continue to characterize the Roman army for centuries. Their concept of citizen service and military excellence became part of Roman identity, even when the structures that had created them no longer existed. In their best moments, the Principes had been more than soldiers. They had been citizens in arms, men who understood that defending Rome was defending everything they valued in life. Their story is the story of an era when civic virtue and military power marched together, before personal ambitions and the needs of empire separated them forever.